Hi friends, back for another edition of Lake of Dragons COVID edition, lockdown edition. We are 4,672 days into the lockdown. Now, feels that way though, doesn't it? I've still got the Corona fro going. You can tell I haven't had a haircut in years, feels like. In any event though, been reading Lake of Dragons, the first Lake of Dragons book, To Kill the Dragon. Trying to help you pass the time as there is nothing else to do. So I hope it's helping. If it's not, yeah, you know, it's helping pass the time for me anyways. So we're on chapter 4 in Lake of Dragons, book 1. This chapter is called Purpose. The path out of the sobbing forest poured into a great field of unkept wheat, seated upon rolling hills that climbed steadily upwards. It was a pale green, waist-high sea of flowing waves dancing about, motivated by a mild north wind. Mylok took a deep breath, inhaling the sweet perfume of the field. He squinted against the brilliance of the midday sun. It was much too bright since his eyes had become accustomed to the darkness of the forest. Perrin covered her eyes and giggled. A feeling of security rushed over her. The fresh north wind peeled the grimy, matted hair from her dirt-streaked face. The crisp, clean air of the field was invigorating after the stale, dead air of the forest. Jom charged off into it, snapping at little bugs and rolling about the tall wheat. Mylok sensed sadness from the trees. They had grown fond of his little group. They knew he had to leave, but they would certainly miss him. He thanked them in his mind for seeing him through safely and promised one day to return with a new song to share. Validus and Grinner carried Mylok and Perrin up the hill away from the sobbing forest. As they did, the trees hummed Mylok's song after them with the energy of a choir in full throat. After a few hours, Mylok and Perrin had crested the hill. As Mylok looked back, he could still see the sobbing forest behind them. The trees subtly waved back and forth. It could have been the wind, but Mylok didn't believe that. A broad smile expanded across his face. "Perrin, look, the trees be waving us goodbye," he said as he nudged her. She turned and waved. "Bye, trees!" Her shout careened down the hill, her small voice sounding quite large as it boomed and echoed through the valley. Mylok nearly lost his wits, laughing like he had just heard a dandy of a joke. Perrin's face reddened as she realized why Mylok laughed so heartily, and she fell into a fit of laughter of her own. It had been a good while since either of them had laughed, so it lasted much longer than the joke deserved. That was okay. The trail had been stingy with happiness. Mylok turned his head back to the north and saw a great valley sprawling below them with a mighty hill rising up on the other side. The path they were on opened into what appeared to be a well-traveled road, branching off in many directions down in the valley. Huts popped up here and there, and the land appeared cultivated. The population seemed denser up the hill on the other side of the valley. His eyes scanned it, and then, at the top, there it was, a mighty castle with towers that scraped at the sky, perched on the hill. The great city of the north, he thought. How magnificent it was. This was what Imhotep was always talking about. No wonder he had always longed to return. It was beautiful. Eyes wide with excitement, he turned to Perrin and said, "Hold on tight. We've been making some time before we lose the light." Perrin nodded in agreement as Mylok put his heels to Validus' sides. Hooves tore into the trail as the horse responded. Grinner followed suit. The animal had little choice, tied fast to Validus' saddle. John had all he could handle just trying to keep up. Mylok kept his eyes on Perrin, watching her fear slowly turn into something close to excitement. After a time, she loosened her grip on Grinner's neck and even sat up a little straighter as she bounced and swayed in the saddle with each of his long strides. The group had made it about halfway down the hill into the valley before Mylok realized John had fallen quite a good distance behind. The sun was getting rather low. Perfect time to stop for the night. A large, flat boulder with a massive tree at its southern edge alongside the trail looked to be just the spot. He halted the horses, dismounted, and got to work. By the time John finally arrived, Mylok had built a small shelter and a cooking fire. The scrod fell in a heap next to the small blaze, whipped by the trail. Mylok prepared a bowl of water for him and some dried tupper slot. That would help him to get his energy back. That and a good night's sleep. Mylok sat down next to Perrin by the fire, handed her a few hunks of dried tupper slot, and asked, "So what do you think about that ride?" Perrin shoveled a hunk of food into her mouth before replying around it. It was scary at first. She swallowed a bit and splashed some water down before finishing. "But only a little. Then I'd be flying over the field." "Hi," Mylok chuckled. "It'd be a freedom you can't hardly describe. Butterflies all brawling in your belly, and the ground racing past faster than anything you ever seen. Perrin silently nodded as she stuffed more food into her face and stared at the fire. "How about them trees all waving and smiling?" he asked. "Aye, and me big voice down the valley." This time she laughed. After the chuckle had a chance to dance off into the darkening sky, she looked up at him and added, "I ain't never been on no journey like this before." Milek nodded down at her and then turned toward the western sky, gazing into the last bits of pink the sun had left behind. "In that we are the same," he agreed. They sat mostly in silence as they finished eating their dried meat and a bit of bread. A sharp snore from John broke up the silence, and he earned a good bit of giggling. The Scrod didn't move despite all the laughter. The road had done a number on the poor animal. Perrin dozed shortly after she finished eating. Milek allowed himself to follow suit once everyone else was settled in. The night was still very young when Milek woke to Jom's growls. The fire was dwindling, but the sun was still far from rising. Milek stoked the fire and threw on some more wood to give himself a bit of additional light. Though the moon was good and full, shadows covered the field as if in defiance. Jom had stepped out on the path and was growling at a dark shape approaching along the trail from the south. Milek readied his sword and lit a torch before stepping out into the path next to the agitated Scrod. "Hey there," Milek called to whatever was approaching. "Who are you that be traveling alone in the darkness?" The shape didn't respond, but did continue advancing toward the camp. It was still a good 100 yards from them when Milek decided to meet whomever or whatever it was before it reached the camp in Perrin. He stalked toward the shape. Jom trotted along beside him, keeping pace. "Identify yourself," Milek commanded. The authority his voice had in the forest was back. The shape failed to slow in the least. The space between Milek and the unknown traveler quickly shrunk. It wasn't long before Milek realized the approaching shape was the same manner of man they had met in the sobbing forest. He raised his sword as Jom's hackles shot up. The Scrod's low growl turned to an angry, threatening bark. Right at that instant, the cloaked figure removed his hood, and Milek recognized that it wasn't simply the same manner of man they had faced in the forest. In fact, it was the same man who had confronted them in the forest. The man, or whatever the creature was, let out a hellish howl as he sprinted toward Milek and Jom. Jom answered the charge, and he and the wily vermin were instantly upon each other. White fangs flashed as Jom lunged for the man's throat. The beast of a man was too quick and snatched the Scrod out of the air by his throat. Jom snapped at the man's face, but could only manage to come within an inch of it. Instead of tearing into flesh, he yelped under the weight of the man's grip. The sound was brief and sharp, and then Jom lay 10 feet west of the trail, tossed to the side like a handful of seed. The Scrod wasn't moving, and Milek felt the man's dead black eyes back on him. Milek didn't wait to see if Jom would regain his feet. He charged the man like a wild mountain scarab running down a fawn. Once in range of his target, the sword arced toward the cloaked man's throat. The velocity of his blade would have easily cleaved the head clean off a full-grown tubber. However, when the weapon shattered helplessly against the cloaked man's forearm rather than lopping the head from his shoulders, Milek realized his quarry was no fawn. Dumbfounded, he stared down at the handle of his broken blade. A chill wind blew off the black field, shivered down his spine, and raced off into the night with his confidence. Milek had precious little time to ponder what kind of monster wore skin capable of withstanding the might of his blade, or what black forge in the pit of some dark forgotten hell could spawn a thing with bones that wouldn't shatter under its force. He barely had time to question his own might before the man's right arm slashed out in a backhanded uppercut and launched him helplessly through the crisp evening air. His jaw began to tighten and swell even before the ground leapt up to meet his careening carcass. No one had ever hit him like that before. Doubt is a mad titan on the battlefield, and it took to knocking Milek's wits around, had him questioning instead of acting. By the time he finally got out of the way of his instincts, the dead-eyed man was on him again. He managed only to get back to his knees before the beast's iron grip closed around his throat, hefted him easily off the ground, and squeezed. His hands shot up and yanked at the stranger's fingers. He might have been trying to pull a mountain up off the ground for all the good it did. The iron grip wouldn't budge. He kicked at the man's legs instead. They were like thick tree trunks, solid and unmoving. Milek's face flushed as white dots flashed and darted before his eyes, and his burning lungs hopelessly searched for air. Just as consciousness began to flee him on a hazy purple cloud, the grip loosened. He landed back on the ground in a heap, barely aware of the dead-eyed man howling and launching vile curses. Laced among those pained shouts was Jom's growl, a song sweet to Milek's ears. The faithful Scrod had returned to the fight. Milik's wits slowly returned as he watched the dead-eyed man dance in a circle and kick his leg in a vain attempt to free his ankle from John's death grip. His howls filled the night sky as he fell to the ground and flopped about. He kicked John's head repeatedly until the Scrod was dazed and could hold him no longer. Just then, Milik had an epiphany. The dead-eyed man was not invincible. The steady gush of some blood-like liquid pouring from the fresh wound John had inflicted on his leg proved as much. The dead-eyed man jumped up and gave John a solid kick to his ribs. The valiant Scrod yelped and then lay whimpering. A fire burned in Milik as he leapt to his feet and charged the stranger. His shoulder found the man's midsection and drove him to the ground. Instinct grabbed hold of the reins again, and his fists were no longer waiting for directions. They pounded the man's face while Milik grunted and growled like a hungry beast in the wild. The assault was short-lived. Mere moments passed before the man managed to free an arm and bring his fist down on the side of Milik's head. The blow knocked Milik to the side. Both combatants quickly scrambled to their feet, Milik woozy from the shot to his head and the dead-eyed man nursing a limp from John's bite. The cloaked stranger charged Milik, who managed to narrowly avoid the attack and pull out his dagger. When the dead-eyed man turned back around to face him, it was too late. Milik grabbed him by the hair and slammed his dagger into his black, dead eye. Fresh howling bellowed from the man's twisted face as black blood poured from the empty socket. Good sense finally prevailed over ego, and Milik quickly retreated. He grabbed John and dragged him back toward the camp. Just over 100 yards away, Perrin lay sleeping soundly, completely unaware of the trouble she was in. Once Milik made it back to camp, he quickly loaded up the horses, roused Perrin, and tied her, along with John, to Grinner's saddle before mounting Validus. He was still a bit woozy and unsure if he could finish the dead-eyed man off. They would have to flee. As unattractive as the prospect of traveling in the darkness of night was, the alternative seemed even worse. Just as Validus and Grinner stepped out onto the path, Milik heard a howl. When he glanced back, the dead-eyed man was back on his feet and limping quickly toward them. Much to Milik's dismay, the vile thing was no longer alone. 2 more cloaked men accompanied him, probably the same 2 who perished, or so he had thought, with the first among the trees. He drove his heels hard into Validus's sides. The horse responded, launching into a mad gallop. Grinner followed suit. And, though Perrin was terrified, she and John were both tied down and safe, at least from breaking against the hard trail. The dead-eyed men gave chase, sprinting after Milik and Perrin, but losing ground. Milik paid them no attention. He kept his eyes on the path. When he finally did look back, it seemed his mind might be playing tricks on him. Otherwise, these monsters were even more frightening than he thought. They appeared to be flying close to the ground with their dirty cloaks flowing behind them. He gave Validus another shot in the sides and their speed increased. He didn't look back again until the sun was in the sky. By the time Milik felt comfortable taking a break, they had made it into the valley and found a place to water the horses. The motley crew he led quickly earned the attention of a good number of curious eyes. He felt scrutinized as the townfolk did little to hide their interest. Under the watchful eyes of nosy townsfolk, they ate quickly. Then Milik strapped Perrin and John back on Grinner's saddle and got the group back on the trail. He scanned the hill behind them, but found no sign of pursuit. The path was clear back up the hill. Had those dead-eyed beasts still been back there, he would see them. A clear trail wasn't quite enough to comfort Milik. Though he hadn't spotted the trio chasing them, he couldn't be sure where they had gone. The road grew wider toward the great city. It was also well-traveled. Milik felt the disapproving stares. 2 dirty children and a beaten Scrod. Nobody bothered with them, but they watched. They watched and humphed with their noses in the air. Milik kept his eyes to the trail and ignored the commentary of the people they passed. "Well, look at there," an old woman's voice cackled, just loud enough to hear. "Where do you suppose them parents be?" A younger voice answered with a bit more volume. "Who could know?" "Ain't got none by the looks," another answered. "Afraid of water, too." Milik paid them no mind. He glanced behind at Grinner. Perrin's misty blue eyes stared back at him, still brimming with innocence. At least the tragic events in her recent history hadn't chased it away completely. That was something. The townsfolk had no idea what they'd been through. They could tell their stories to each other, make up their dramas to add a bit of excitement to their lives. Milik didn't have anything to prove to any of them. Scuffling with bored folks who had nothing better to do than speculate about a couple of youngsters in a Scrod wouldn't solve anything. It certainly wouldn't help Perrin hang on to what innocence she had left after all she'd seen in the few days since their paths crossed. Let them talk. Validus and Grinner slowed a bit as the road rose up the hill on the other side of the valley and travel became more difficult. Stone towers stood as beacons at the top of the hill far above them. The horses dug in and pushed on as if drawn by these mighty towers scratching at the sky. They were still making good time, and Jam appeared to slowly be regaining his strength. The group rode along in silence. Malik had nothing he felt like talking about, and Perrin hadn't made a peep. They trudged wearily on, slouching in their saddles. The trail had whipped them. Once dusk began to settle in, Malik noticed three shapes that seemed to be floating toward them again some distance back. It appeared the dead-eyed men hadn't given up their pursuit after all. They had just been more careful not to be spotted in the sunlight. It didn't look as if they were gaining any ground on the group, but they certainly hadn't lost any either. Malik, in his frustration, thought briefly about facing them once more. The idea died a quick death. The trail had taken most of the fight he had in him. Conquering the remainder of the hill would probably earn the rest. Those dead-eyed things would have to be dealt with eventually, but they were a good distance back. Apparently, John felt less comfortable about the distance. His hackles went up as he growled a low warning that would have been lost on all but Malik's small group. Had the scrod not been bound good and tight to Grinner's saddle, he might have tried running those beasts down and having another go at them. As it was, all he could do was lie there and growl. The path continued to brighten as they approached the kingdom. Torches burned along the road, and light poured out from the huts lining it on either side. The monsters pursuing them were far enough back that Malik could no longer see them through the torchlight. The fact did little to ease his tension. The bizarre chill lingering about his spine was all the proof he needed that they were still there, and they were coming. As the group trudged up the hill toward the great city, the buzz they created among the townsfolk seemed to grow into a live and tangible thing. Whispers and grumbles sprang from all sides. Here and there a head would pop out of a window and someone would mutter at them. They'd say things about demons wandering around in the darkness, or staying off the road, or staying away from their home, or blah, blah, blah. Malik ignored it all. His goal was clear to him, and it was all that mattered. The townsfolk knew nothing of him or his small group. Then suddenly, as if the massive iron thing had been hiding in the ground and sprung up 20 feet into the air to catch Malik and his group by surprise, the iron gate loomed before them. As odd as it might sound, the heavy closed gate, wide enough for two carriages with bars as thick as a big man's thigh, appeared as welcoming as the open arms of an old friend. A great wall of brick and mortar surrounded the oily, wonderful thing, and a mighty iron emblem hung above it, etched with the word Havenstal. The great city Imatath had spoken of so fondly finally had a name. Havenstal, Malik nearly gasped as his eyes moved ever upward, above that most excellent of words, to a picture of a Fallon with a grand rack and a helmet, the symbol of his father's house, the house that finally had a name, Havenstal. Relief swept over Malik like the first bit of warmth off a new fire on a cold night as he marveled at the symbol stretching toward the sky before him. Wrapped with delight, he hardly noticed Perrin's sleepy eyes peering over his shoulder. "Is that being our new home now?" Perrin's voice sounded small. "That's what I'd be hoping," he replied as he pressed his gaze to the thick iron bars. The biggest bridge Malik had ever seen stretched up against a giant wall on the other side of a wide chasm. How deep he could not tell from his vantage point. It was quite deep from what Imatath had told him, and at the bottom flowed the river they had crossed into the sobbing forest. He had told Malik that to get to the great kingdom of the north, you must cross the river twice. This would be the second crossing. Two guards dressed in full armor, so shiny they seemed to glow in the torchlight, stood posted in front of the gate with spears at the ready. "State your name and business with the house of Havenstal, lad." The guard to the left spoke with authority. Malik was quite sure of his name, but not completely sure of his business. "I be Malik, this be Perrin, and we be seeking one that we lost." His voice carried as much confidence as he could muster in his tired, road-weary state. "Malik, whom do you seek? What business do children be having traveling alone in the dark? What house you be riding for?" The guard's tone carried an undeniable note of skepticism. "If I be riding for a house, it be the house of Imatath. As for the business of children, we've no place to stay nor a parent to care for us. The road has been our home for a time." Malik had enough of his wits left about him to handle the guard's interrogation quite handily. "Imatath ain't no house," the guard began. "Imatath rides for the house of Havenstal, which be standing before you now. What do you know of the great and mighty Imatath?" "I be knowing that he raised me from a babe, trained me as a warrior, and been the only father I ever known." His reply was curt. "Imatath ain't no one's father. A warrior he be, with the fury of the mightiest army on Ulos at his command. Now you tell me that he be a father? The duty of me post don't allow for laughter, but what you say be more than ridiculous." A slight chuckle accompanied the guard's words. "I be speaking what I know," Malik continued. "The man who raised me was named Imatath, and he acted as me father till he abandoned me the last time the moon be at its fullest. Lost track of the days as I'd be weary from the road, but I'd be guessing it to be weeks now. The first guard whispered something to the other and then returned to Milek. Water your horses there and then go inside and sit by the fire till I call for you, he said as he pointed first to a well and then to a hut on Milek's left side. I've sent for Imatov. Welcome home, Milek. Forgive the questioning. You be quite dirty from the road, and I had to be sure that you are the one Imatov be expecting. Your lord would be all full of the rage if I'd be sounding off a false alarm. Milek did as he was instructed. First he watered the horses, then he took Perrin and Job inside the hut to wait for Imatov. Shadows crept around the stone room as flames danced about in a small fire. The girl and the Scrod found sleep quickly while Milek thought about what he might say to his father. His mind was like a mass of mashed stew. It was certainly nice to be expected, but the road had been an unforgiving witch. Perrin and John were evidence of that. Their eyes were nearly closed before he'd even gotten them inside the guard's room. Milek was twisted in a tangle of mixed emotion when the heavy wooden door burst open. Milek, me son, Imatov boomed. Milek hesitated only for a moment before running to his mentor and embracing him. Father, was all he could muster at first. You've passed your last test. You'll be ready for the trials. Pride dripped from Imatov's words as he all but shouted. You haven't a few words about me test, Father. I thought you abandoned me, that you left me to die. I did almost die. How could you do that to me? Milek's tone grew almost accusatory as his anger mounted. Milek, me son, Imatov began as he pushed Milek back to arm's length and looked him in the eye. That'd be the way it had to be. The road before you ain't an easy one by no measure, and I'd be needing to know that you be prepared for it. Had the road claimed you, then I'd know you ain't suited for your purpose, and your life would be without meaning anyway. You've had no reason to be, lad. So you'd be chancing the sacrifice of the closest thing you've ever had to a son to test your ability as a trainer? Rage bubbled up in him, betrayed by the only parent he had ever known. You have but a tool for your ego, Father. Stand down, Milek, Imatov commanded with a king's authority in his voice. You've done nothing without purpose, and the trials you be facing will be much more perilous than anything the road could have offered you. You must be trusting me when I be saying, had you known I'd be testing you, you'd not have been challenged at all. You've a great mind, Milek. You know this to be true. Milek's rage yearned to spill out at Imatov, to engulf him in a flood of accusations, but he did speak the truth. He had trained Milek to do exactly what he had done, conquer the road to Havenstal. Had he known his purpose, it would have been no challenge at all. Now, however, there was this new thing, the trials. Judging from Imatov's brief description, they would not be easy tasks. Milek's ire faded slowly like dyed fabric left out in the bright sun as his thoughts turned towards his next challenge. Son, Imatov began again, I knew you'd conquer the road. You'd be the mightiest warrior I've ever had the pleasure of standing next to in battle. I be meaning that. You'll be passing the trials and continuing on your path. You'll be the greatest hero this world has ever known. They'll sing songs about you, lad. Now let's get you cleaned up. As Imatov turned back toward the door, he nearly tripped over Perrin and John. Well, what have we here? He asked with a raised brow. Milek had all but forgotten. Oh, he began. I found this little lass in a small village on the banks of the river. Her name be Perrin. Her home had been attacked by a Matalazo the night before I arrived. Described be John. He'd be the only reason she survived. No one else did. She'd no one to care for her, so I took her as me own till I be finding a safe home for her. Imatov frowned a bit and shook his head. "'Tis a noble thing you done, son, though I be wishing you were without the baggage. You did the right thing. We'll be finding a caring family to raise her." The two men roused Perrin and John and headed out of the small hut, chatting as they went. Imatov ordered the guards to send for someone to care for the horses, and then he and Milek's group started across the great wooden bridge into Havenstal. They were just inside the gate when a scout who had been watching the perimeter of the outlying town came charging up the road, hailing Imatov. "Sir!" the scout shouted. Imatov stopped and turned. "What be troubling you, scout?" "Cloaked men on the road, my lord. They seem to be floating above the ground," the scout reported, stopping to salute. Floating? That be sounding like the myth. Could it be? Imatov asked, mostly to himself. "What myth?" Milek asked. "There be a myth about men with black dead eyes and wild orange hair. They be the high priest of Kalam," Imatov answered offhandedly, still trying to reason why they'd be heading up the road to Havenstal. "They don't be having thoughts of their own. Kalam's thoughts be all they know. They were all men once. They be the only men to have direct contact with Kalam, and enforce his law. Can't be. Even if they be real, what could they be wanting with Havenstal?" "Black dead eyes?" Milek asked. "Those be the men who attacked us in the sobbing forest. They attacked us both in the forest and the night while we camped. They've been following us since the forest." "What?" Imatov almost hissed. "Run, Milek." He pushed his son further across the bridge. Then he turned back to the carts. Close the gate. Don't be hindering them. They'll have you at your hides, but don't be hurrying about nothing either. Imatov scooped Perrin up under his arm and sprinted across the bridge that quickly closed after he, Perrin, Milek, and Jam had crossed it. As they ran, he instructed Milek to tell him exactly what they were doing when first attacked by the priests in the forest. Milek recounted the whole story as they ran. He told them about the song he was singing the first time they encountered them, how fiercely the trees had defended them. Then he recounted the episode on the dark trail and how they followed the rest of the way to the Great Iron Gate. Imatov listened, shaking his head and cursing under his breath. Once safely inside the city walls, Imatov quickly guided them to an interior guard station, leaving Perrin and John with two stout men on duty there, along with instructions to hide them both until he returned. And he explained to Milek the severity of what he had done in the forest. Milek, he began, quite out of breath, you've been knowing about Callum's law. You've been knowing that you're supposed to be worshiping none other than him. When you sang in honor of them trees, well, that been a kind of worship. You broke the law he gave us, lad. You've disrespected Callum. You've disrespected your God, your maker. Do you understand me, son? I meant no disrespect, Father, Milek stammered. This I be knowing. That don't change the fact that you broke his law. And those priests be wishing to punish you for your transgressions. That means Callum be wishing to punish you for your transgression. We must get you to the temple so you can beg his forgiveness and, hopefully, lessen your penalty. In the future, son, don't be trusting the trees. They be evil. Aye, Father. Milek had no idea how to respond. Milek was barely aware of the polished stone streets his feet hammered against or the massive walls stretching toward the sky beside him as he charged along close at Imatov's heels. How could singing to trees be an affront to his God? How could sharing a tune be a sin? It made no sense. The trees didn't seem evil at all. Sure, they were frightening at the outset, but once they grew comfortable with him and his group, they were downright friendly, even helpful when those vile creatures set upon them. How could those things be priests of Callum? They seemed evil, like something that crawled out of the deepest, darkest pit to terrorize the world. The questions fled when Imatov reached back, grabbed a firm hold of Milek's sleeve, and all but dragged him up the steps toward yet another large brick building. Everything in the city was brick upon brick. Milek gave half a moment to consider who might have laid all that brick and how long it must have taken. The thought was there and gone, chased away by the marvel before him. Windows of colored glass, glowing red with light from within and etched with scenes of stories Milek had learned, reading the book, and the righteous terror on his tail. They pounded through a heavy wooden door, Imatov still dragging Milek behind him. Inside the temple, rows of wooden benches lined either side of a wide path leading to a shimmering praying altar. An image of a bold and vibrant old man, painted in colors so bright it seemed he might step right off the brick, graced the wall behind it. Above the image was that of the great eagle, Callum, wings spread and ruling the sky. Imatov dragged Milek all the way up to the altar and then stopped. Kneel, Imatov commanded Milek. Beg Callum's forgiveness. Pour your heart and soul into the prayer, son. Pray like you've never prayed before. Imatov's eyes darted about the room while his hands trembled. Milek had never seen him so aghast. Imatov feared nothing. At least that is what Milek had always believed. Watching his hero shiver and twitch like a coward among corpses chilled Milek to his bones. He clinched his eyes up tight and feverishly prayed, his lips moving around silent words, apologizing over and over again for his song to the trees, and then reciting every prayer he knew. Imatov knelt beside him and offered his own prayers, begging Callum's forgiveness for his thick-headed son. Both men had their heads buried in folded hands as their feverish whispers choked out in the silence of the temple. The temple door blasted open again as the priests flooded in. Imatov spun and flung himself at their feet, wrapping his arms around the leader's legs. Please have mercy, my lord. The lad knew not what he did, Imatov nearly sobbed. Milek turned in time to see the priest grab a handful of Imatov's cloak and toss the great warrior aside, slamming his helpless body against the wall. Milek's fear melted against the fire burning in his gut. He was ready to go around with the monsters again. Callum's priests are not. He was done fleeing. His jaw flexed as he stood tall before them like a stone statue facing off against a furious storm. Imatov gave in to the sobbing and begged. Milek, please, he cried, stand down. Shut your dribbling gob, you worthless scrod, the leader hissed at Imatov. The great and mighty Imatov, blubbering like a damned fool. His eyes turned back to Milek, who remained unflinching. Milek, he began, are you afraid, lad? Are you afraid of what I'm going to have these monsters do to you? Are you fighting back tears? Do you want to run from me like some kind of animal? Imatov cried out to Milek, that be the voice of Callum himself, son. Don't be challenging him. Kneel before your God, boy. One of the priests stalked over to where Emetoth lay against the wall and grabbed him up by the throat. He picked him up off the floor like a sack of rags before slamming him into the wall. Mylek scowled as his father lost consciousness at the dead-eyed man's feet. Get away from me, father, Mylek commanded, his booming voice filling the temple and echoing back off the polished stone walls. You've yet to answer my queries, lad. Are you afraid? The priest's voice was powerful and frightening, but Mylek remained unmoved. I be full aware of me transgression and honor in the trees with song. I stand before you now, ready to accept me punishment, truthfully unafraid. Me father, though, he be committing no sin. He be spending his whole life in your faithful service. I be asking that you be merciful to him. The fire burned hotter in him than it ever had before. His eyes began to glow a dull red. The priest that had been speaking began to chuckle and then stopped just short of an all-out laugh. Mylek, the trees are of no consequence. They do serve the dragon and symbolize all that is evil, but your resolve is much too strong for their wiles. I sent my priest to test your might. Trees or no trees, you would have met these beasts one way or another. The forest was simply the perfect, dark, frightening place for you to have your first meeting. You are to be my champion, Mylek, the champion of this world. I need to know you are ready, for the road before you is much more perilous than the road behind. You are ready, my son. You are ready. As for your father, you have no idea how much courage it took for him to stand before me as he did. As your mind ages, you'll begin to understand. For now, don't let his whimpering lessen your image of him. You're different than him. You're different than any of my creations. I still keep Emetoth in my grace. He is a faithful servant to me, and a brave testament to what a man should be. You will continue on your path and he on his. We are finished here for now. I am the God of all creation. I am all powerful. With the last statement, the three priests replaced their hoods in unison and floated backward out of the temple. Mylek was ready to explode. His mind was a battlefield of emotion, each fighting to take control of him. Very slowly, he relaxed. Everything that had happened between his hut in the forest and standing before the God of all creation played through his mind like an endless wheel. The one thing he could not come to grips with was Callum speaking to him. He finally had evidence of his importance in this world. The Lord, Callum, had spoken to him. The book, Callum's Word, only records 2 other human beings ever having direct contact with Callum. Why me, he thought. What makes me different than any other? He still didn't have any real answers, but he felt closer than ever. Emetoth began to stir. Mylek rushed over and roused him. Father, are you all right? He asked as he shook his father a little less than gently. Emetoth mumbled a bit, but none of the sounds coming out of him could be considered words. His eyes chased around the room. Then he coughed a bit and rubbed his throat. The dead-eyed men were strong. Mylek could attest to that, and one of them had given Emetoth a good squeeze of his throat. Mylek helped the old soldier to sit upright against the wall. Mylek, Emetoth cried out. I'm here, father, Mylek replied softly in Emetoth's ear. Are we dead? He whispered. No, father. The priests have gone. Callum spoke to me. He said you are a brave man and you stand tall in his sight. Mylek's tone was reassuring. Emetoth would be crushed at the thought of falling from Callum's grace. He was a man of strong faith who had devoted his life to the service of his God. Aye, lad, I heard him speak, Emetoth thought for a moment, then continued. He called me a scrod. I wept before me, Lord. Tears welled, threatening to pour over his eyelids. No, father, Mylek shook his head. You were merely in the way of his purpose. You distracted him, nothing more. And that brought his angry tongue upon you. Mylek, you be like the Lord now. I always be believing the myths and been believing you to be the one they be speaking of. But now there be proof. Ye be me Lord now. I be unfit for your presence. His eyes quickly dropped away from Mylek's. No, father, Mylek began. Don't be calling me that no more. Ye be me Lord now. Emetoth's words came amid sobs that had taken him. Ye be the father now. I be fleeing from your sight. I be unworthy of your company. But father, Mylek stopped. Emetoth was asleep. The encounter with the priest and finally being forced to face Mylek's purpose was too much. Mylek held him close and eventually drifted off to sleep himself, amid thoughts of all that had been and all that was yet to come. All right, that's the end of chapter 4. Hope you enjoyed it. Stay safe. Try not to get too bored out there, and happy reading.